When you think of the founding of the Boy Scouts of America, names like Baden Powell, Ernest Thompson Seton, Daniel Carter Beard, William D. Boyce, and James E. West come to mind. But one other individual had a great deal of impact on the formation of the organization, as well as another youth organization at about the same time. Learn about this amazing individual, Dr. Charles Eastman, on this edition of Artifact of the Week. Dr. Charles Eastman was a Dakota Sioux born on a reservation near Redwood Falls, Minnesota on February 19, 1858. At birth, he was named Hakata, which means pitiful last, because his mother died not long after his birth. He was the youngest of 5 children, and later his name was changed to Ohiasa, which means always wins, following a victory by his village in a lacrosse tournament. As a boy, Ohiasa was raised in the original teachings of the Dakota way of life. Here are his words.
What boy would not be an Indian for a while when he thinks of the freest life in the world? This life was mine. Every day there was a real hunt. There was real game. We studied the habits of animals, just as you study your books.
Then in 1862, when he was 4 years old, the Minnesota Massacre tore apart his family. His father was arrested and imprisoned. Ohiasa, his grandmother, and a few other family members fled to Canada. According to his writings, the family believed that his father and 2 older brothers had been killed. In Canada, Ohiasa's band roamed free and lived off the land, just as they had prior to the 1862 massacre.
I was now in exile, as well as motherless, yet I was not unhappy. I was trained thoroughly for an all-around outdoor life. I was a good rider and a good shot with the bow and arrow, alert and alive to everything. I had never known nor ever expected to know any life but this.
In 1873, at the age of 15, Ohiasa's life changed significantly.
One day when I was away on the daily hunt, 2 strangers from the United States visited our camp. They were Indians, but clad in the white man's garments. It was as well that I was absent with my gun. My faithful grandmother was on the watch and met me to break the news. "Your father has come, he whom we thought dead at the hands of the white men," she said.
During his imprisonment, Ohiasa's father and brothers converted to Christianity, and his father took the English name Jacob Eastman.
He was still satisfied there was no alternative for the Indian. He was now anxious to have his boys learn the English language and something about books, for he could see that these were the bow and arrows of the white man.
Ohiasa and his grandmother returned to the United States with his father. When they returned, they also converted to Christianity and were baptized. The pastor told Ohiasa he needed to pick a new name and gave him a book of names to look through. Because Ohiasa couldn't read English, he opened the book and pointed to a name. His new name would be Charles. Charles got his hair cut and started school the next day. While he didn't care for the new life he was living, he also couldn't resist his father's logic, and after a year of school was transferred to an Indian boarding school in Santee, Nebraska, where his older brother had attended. Next, Charles found himself continuing his education at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. Dartmouth was founded in 1769 as a school to educate young Native Americans in Christian theology and liberal arts. He graduated from Dartmouth in 1887.
I went to Old Dartmouth in the fall of 1883 to enter the freshman class. It was here that I had most of my savage gentleness and native refinement knocked out of me.
From Dartmouth, Charles went on to study medicine at Boston University, graduating in 1890 as only the 2nd Native American physician ever. Following medical school, Eastman returned to the West and served with the Bureau of Indian Affairs as the doctor at the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. While at Pine Ridge, Eastman met his wife, Elaine Goodall, a white woman who was the head of the reservation school. She was also an advocate for Native American issues and a published poet. Eastman was the doctor at Pine Ridge during the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 and cared for the wounded Sioux on the reservation following the massacre. The massacre at Wounded Knee had a profound effect on Eastman. It was the second time he had witnessed federal troops killing his people.
We found the body of a woman completely covered with a blanket of snow. We found them scattered along as they had been relentlessly hunted down and slaughtered while fleeing for their lives. It took all of my nerve to keep my composure in the face of this spectacle. All this was a severe ordeal for one who had so lately put all his faith in the Christian love and lofty ideals of the white man.
Eastman and his wife left Pine Ridge in 1892 and headed back to Minnesota, where Eastman planned to establish a private medical practice. But this did not happen because the people of Minnesota weren't interested in a Dakota Sioux doctor. So his wife Elaine encouraged him to become a writer and to share the stories of his childhood that he would share with his children. His first stories were published in 1893 and 1894 in St. Nicholas magazine. This was also the time when Eastman became active with a new organization called the YMCA. Between 1894 and 1899, Eastman helped establish 32 Indian groups for the YMCA and introduced Native Americans to basketball. In 1902, Eastman published his memoir, Indian Boyhood, the story of the first 15 years of his life. Ernest Thompson Seton was so inspired by this book that he asked Eastman to help him develop and establish the Woodcraft Indians as a consultant on the integration and use of Native American culture and themes in his program. Later, Eastman and Seton were asked by the YMCA to develop and launch the YMCA Indian Scouts for young urban boys. During the early 1900s, Eastman wrote 11 books in total and toured the country as a speaker advocating for his people, sharing not only his story, but the stories of the Sioux and the profound humanity of his people in a way that is relatable to all that hear him speak.
My chief object has been not to entertain, but to present the American Indian in his true character before Americans. The barbarous and atrocious character commonly attributed to him has dated from the transition period when the strong drink, powerful temptations, and commercialism of the white man led to deep demoralization. I feel that I was a pioneer in this new line of defense of the Native American, not so much of his rights in the land as of his character and religion.
In 1910, Seton and Eastman again partnered, this time with the Boy Scouts of America, to integrate Native American culture and beliefs into the new organization, with Eastman also serving on the National Committee, in addition to working with Seton as a consultant on Native American affairs. Eastman believed that if he could influence and get young white American children to think like an Indian at a young age, that you could get them to embrace those values and those ideas as they grew older. In the collection here at the National Scouting Museum, not only do we have copies of some of Eastman's books, including Indian Scout Talks, a guide for Boy Scouts and Campfire Girls, a book that was first published in 1914 by Eastman and was written as a guide for the two organizations to help their members and others learn and understand about the reasons and feelings behind a life in the outdoors. In it, he writes, "These chapters represent the actual experiences and firsthand knowledge of the author. My training was along these lines until I was nearly 16 years of age. It is with the earnest hope that they may prove useful to all who venture into the wilderness in pursuit of wisdom, health, and pleasure, that they are dedicated to the Boy Scouts of America and the Campfire Girls of America." We also have 3 interesting letters in the collection. The first is an October 1912 letter from Eastman to Ernest Thompson Seton, asking Seton to write a letter of recommendation for him to the President of the United States as a nominee for the position of Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The second letter is a copy of the letter Seton wrote to President Taft on behalf of Eastman. Seton writes, "I am most earnestly and respectfully, therefore, beg of you to make the appointment of Dr. Charles A. Eastman to the vacant position. He is better qualified to understand and face the numerous problems than any other man in America of whom I have any knowledge." The third letter is from Seton back to Eastman, acknowledging his request and letting him know his request has been granted. While Eastman was not chosen for the role, he did remain very involved as an activist for Native American issues and affairs, paving the way for Native American activism such as the Red Power movement of the 1960s. One final point about Charles Eastman. Many historians and scholars view Eastman and many members of his family as assimilationists, in that they allowed themselves to be used by white men for their own purposes. But to his family, this is simply not true. They view Eastman's decisions and actions to be brave and strategic, that he made decisions that were in line with his Dakota customs, beliefs, and heritage. They were decisions and actions that not only allowed him to survive, but to thrive. He used his education and subsequent fame to work from the inside to make changes that would benefit his people. For example, Eastman resisted wearing traditional Sioux clothing when he spoke for fear of being labeled a show Indian. But over time, he learned that when he wore his traditional clothing and his native headdress, white people would be quiet and pay attention to what he had to say. It gave him a level of credibility he could not command when he was simply dressed like the people he was speaking to. Eastman is a fine example of a person who sacrificed much for the benefit of many. To learn more about Charles Eastman, check out the documentary, Ohiasa, The Soul of an Indian. That's all the time we have for now. Join us next time as we look at another National Scouting Museum artifact of the week.